So good to see everybody this evening. Hope that you're having a good week so far. Of course, this is our midweek Bible study, and we're engaged in a spring series on tests of the Bible. Tonight we have another regular, John McMath. He's regular because we love him so much. He does such a great job. And John is doing good work in Gardendale at the Decatur Highway Church of Christ. He's been there several years now. And he and Jordan Ware and the people up there are just doing such a great job. And that's a very strong church, very faithful church. And a lot of it has to do with the teaching and the ministry of John. John is an excellent speaker. His material is always worth our while. And I know that tonight will be no different. One of our favorite stories from 1 Samuel 17, we're going to be talking about facing giants and the test of courage.
Good evening. It is indeed an honor to be here. It is always an honor to be here, and I'm always grateful for the invitation when Drew sends it out. I've told you before, and I don't think it wears out to say how much I love and appreciate this church. I've got a lot of memories with this church going back, at least 3 decades. A little bit, almost 4 decades. Boy, I'm really dating myself now. But appreciate everything that has been done here. And of course, the affinity that we have for this church from Decatur Highway to Asheville Road has a lot to do with Drew. The folks over there just love Drew, and we appreciate him. And of course, he got his start over there a little bit with us, and then came over here with you guys and been here all those years. But the folks over there love him, and I love him as well. And I have gotten the opportunity to know and to love the Kaiser family even more, because Ash is now worshiping with us, he and his family. And then I've spent some time with their dad, Andy, and that's been a joy. So there are just a lot of connections and a lot of roots that are being developed and that are growing deep, and that just makes me love coming over here even more. And you folks are always very, very encouraging to me, and I am grateful for that. I will say that when I started to say Ash, I'm sorry about that, Drew. Forgive me. I know brothers hate to be called by each other's names. But when Drew emailed me and said, I want you to deal with David and Goliath, facing giants, I went, wow. Because doesn't everybody love the story of David and Goliath? I mean, don't you just love to hear that story told, and the great victory by the young shepherd boy? And you can almost put yourself in his shoes, and that one stone in a sling, and throwing it around your head and letting it go, and it hits its mark right in the middle of that giant's forehead, and he just goes to the ground immediately. And it's the stuff superheroes are made out of. And when we hear this story when we're children, I think that's kind of the way we build the story up. And most of us would have loved to have been David, at least at the point that giant hits the ground, right? Maybe not standing in front of him, but at least at the point that the giant hits the ground and the victory is won for God and His people. And so I was excited about it at first, and then as I began to look at it and began to study the text and put the lesson together, I then went, oh no. And I said, oh no, not because I don't want to deal with it or don't enjoy dealing with it, but everybody knows the story of David, right? And those familiar stories that everybody knows, I'm not going to tell you anything new. It's impossible to tell you anything new. Because we do know the story and we know the background of the story. But I think it is worth our time to take the time and look at the story again, maybe with fresh eyes, maybe in a little bit different way, maybe a little bit different angle or a little bit different light, and to see many of the things that are contained within the story that will help us as we grow, as the subtitle of the lesson is, in our courage. It's a test of courage. David had to have courage to go up against that giant. He had to have courage to do what he did on that particular day. Now, I will tell you one thing, and I don't know why this never occurred to me, but as I was reading through the text and studying this, something that did jump out at me this time in looking at it, that I want to point out even before we get into the heart of the lesson, because I think it has something to do with the rest of the lesson. But one of the interesting things about the Bible, 1 Samuel 17 follows 1 Samuel 16. You notice that in your Bible? It's just one of those neat little things. Chapter 17 is right after chapter 16. Anybody remember what happens in chapter 16? Remember Samuel? He goes to the home of Jesse, and he's there to anoint a king. And Eliab and the other brothers, they come in one by one. And Samuel looks at these big strapping boys of Jesse's and surely this is the king. No, that's not the king, God tells him. And so then finally they bring in this little boy, David. And God says, that's him. 1 Samuel 16 and verse 7 we read, "But the Lord said to Samuel, do not look on his appearance or on the height of his stature, because I have rejected him," talking about Eliab. "For the Lord sees not as man sees, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." We so often are impressed with what we see. We look at the externals of something or someone, and we become impressed with those externals. And we're overwhelmed by them, and we judge people based upon them. I know we try to tell ourselves not to judge a book by its cover, but don't we? We try to tell ourselves don't depend on the appearance so much, but look at the substance, but don't we? We find ourselves so often looking at the outside, looking at the externals, and we form our opinions. And far too many times when we form our opinions on the externals, our opinions are wrong. And we end up having to change our mind as time goes on. That was true of Samuel, and I think it's true of us as well. And it may be true of us as we look at the story of David and Goliath. I think one of the things that's incredible about this story is David, at this point in time, as he comes into the story in chapter 17, he is given the ability to see as God sees. Charles Swindoll, in his book on David, he notes the fact that the real giant on that day was David. And he refers to Goliath not as a giant, but as a dwarf. He was much smaller than anybody thought that he was. When you look at him compared to God, he really doesn't measure up. They thought that Goliath was big, that he was a giant. But compared to God, he was no giant, because God's bigger than Goliath or any other giant that you might face. They thought that Goliath was powerful, but God is more powerful. Matter of fact, he's all powerful. And so as David comes into the camp and he hears the challenge of Goliath, we see David looking at Goliath not as his brothers were looking at Goliath, or the other Jewish soldiers were looking at Goliath, or as even King Saul was looking at Goliath, but we see David seeing Goliath the way God saw Goliath. And that is the key to David's courage on that particular day. So what I want us to do tonight as we look at the story is I want us to see three facets of the story that I think will help us draw some things out of it that will help us as we face maybe other giants in life. Maybe not a physical giant like a Goliath, but other giants that we may face, things that we will encounter that seem far bigger than we are, far bigger than we think we can handle, and far greater or more powerful than we think we're able to handle. But God's able, and God is always able. And that is the great lesson of the story of David and Goliath. And so the first thing I want us to think about as we look at the story is to take a look at the enemy himself. And the enemy obviously in the story is Goliath. In verse 4 of 1 Samuel 17, we're told, there came out of the camp, out from the camp of the Philistines, a champion named Goliath of Gath, whose height was 6 cubits and a span. Now, I don't know about you, but that's a little bit of a curious description to me. Because how many of you, if you got a table you need to fit into a particular spot in your house, you measure it and you say, well, it is so many cubits in a span. How many of you done that lately? We don't measure in cubits and spans, do we? We measure in feet and inches. And so people have argued exactly how tall was Goliath, and one of the problems is that measurements in ancient times were not as exact as we think of measurements today. A cubit, for instance, was understood to be about the length of an adult man's forearm, from his elbow to the tip of his middle finger. Now, if you know some pretty tall people, and I've measured, mine is about 18 inches, somewhere in that neighborhood. But if you know some tall people, their arm length is a little bit longer. So if they're going to measure it, it's going to be a little bit longer than 18 inches. It may be a good bit longer than 18 inches. And so we don't know exactly how all of this was measured. We don't know the exact measurements. But most people have estimated that Goliath was somewhere in the region of 9.5 to 9 feet 9 inches tall. And that's if we use a standard cubit of that day, around 18 inches. And he's going to wind up about 9.5 to 9 feet 9 inches tall. Now, I don't know if you've ever met anybody that tall. Anybody ever met somebody 9 feet and 9 inches tall? I didn't think so. You know, if you look up in the Guinness Book of World Records, I think the tallest man that they have ever listed in there was a little over 8 feet tall. That's pretty tall, but it's still not as tall as Goliath was. I'm a Florida Gator fan. I grew up in Florida, and so, you know, some things still stick with you. And I don't know if y'all heard, but our basketball team won the national championship this year. I like mentioning that. But one of the reasons I like mentioning that is there's an interesting guy on our team. Now, he didn't play a whole lot this year. He's a freshman, and so he'll develop and maybe play a little bit more as time goes on. But he's touted as the tallest teenager in the world. His name is Olivier Rioux, if I pronounce that right. I'm not even sure I'm pronouncing it right. But Olivier Rioux, I got a little picture there. This is part of a team picture. I cropped it down a little bit so you could get a good look. Now, if you look at the two fellows on that side of Olivier, he's obviously the one in the middle that kind of sticks up above everybody. The two guys on that side, both of those guys are 6 feet 11 inches tall. The guy right next to him on this other side is 7 feet tall. And then the guy next to him is another, he's 6'10 or 6'11, somewhere around there. I forget his exact measurements, but he's right around that height. You see how much Olivier's head sticks up above those guys? That's 7 feet 9 inches tall. That's his official measurements according to the University of Florida. And he's been that tall for several years. He played high school basketball at the measurement of 7 feet 6 inches tall. So he's grown 3 inches since he got in college. And he claims that's just the shoes they put him in. I don't know about that. There are some interesting pictures online if you search of when Florida won the SEC championship and then when they won the national championship. You know, they all go to cut down the nets and they save a part of the net as a trinket. And all of the other team players, even the 6'11 and 7 foot guys, they got a ladder that they get up on and they cut part of the net. Olivier just walked up and clipped it and, you know, walked away. He didn't even use the ladder. So this is a tall guy. Goliath was 2 feet taller than Olivier. 2 feet taller. That's huge. That's massive. That's enormous. And if you don't even think about from the bottom of his feet to the top of his head, what about when he raises his arms? Now, the average man as they refer to it in basketball terms, the average man's wingspan. If you were to take your arms and stick them out to your side, and they measured from the tip of your longest finger to the tip of your longest finger on either side of you, it is basically going to equal your height. However tall you are, your wingspan is about the same. Now, there are a few people, and the gentleman on the far side over there, number 9, his wingspan is actually a little bit longer than his height, about 4 inches longer than his height. And so he's got these long arms. He's able to reach in and do things that other people can't ordinarily do because he's just got those long arms. You imagine Goliath standing 9 feet 9 inches tall. He sticks his hands above his head. How high his hands must have been at that particular point. I mean, this is a big guy. But with Goliath, it wasn't just his size, because the text goes on to tell us that he had a coat of mail, according to the ESV. Some others will describe it in another way. But he had a coat of mail, and of course that's kind of a linked metal vest or garment that is intended to protect the body. And it's measured at 175 to 200 pounds. He put that on to go out to battle every day when he went out to battle. His helmet and his shin guards and his spear were all made of brass, and just the head of his spear weighed about 20 to 25 pounds. Just the head of it. Now, he also had a shield, and the word that's used for shield there describes a large shield, and the large shield that a soldier of that time would carry was supposed to be about body height, from around your shoulders to your feet, so that they could easily duck below it and it would protect them from arrows and spears and things of that nature. Now, usually a guy like Goliath, the champion, he didn't carry his own shield. He had a shield bearer. Can you imagine being that guy having to carry the shield that would guard a guy like Goliath that was that big? And so when we look at this story and we look at the size of Goliath, we have to take a step back for a moment. We have to kind of put ourselves in David's shoes and in the shoes of the other Jewish soldiers, Israelite soldiers, as they were looking at this massive man. And what they must have thought as he was challenging the armies of Israel, challenging whatever champion they might have to come out and fight him on the field of battle. I don't know how many of you are professional wrestling fans, and some people want to admit that and some people don't. When I was a teenager, the professional wrestling circuit in Florida, where I grew up, they occasionally would come to your local high school and do a benefit show. And so they would bring their top guys in, and they set up the ring, and they would do their thing, and the school would get part of the proceeds to support the athletics and so forth and so on. And I remember there were 2 guys that were popular at that time, a guy by the name of Lex Luger, if any of you recognize that name, and a guy by the name of Barry Windham. Now, they were a tag team. And, you see these guys on TV, and all of them look about the same size, and it's kind of hard to figure out exactly how big they are. Now, when I was in high school at this particular time, I stood almost the same height I am now, 5'11", 6 foot. I'm 6'1", so I thought I'm a pretty tall guy. I'm standing there in the gymnasium because we had to help out with everything, and so these wrestlers start coming in to go to the locker room to prepare for the show and for the program. And I see Lex Luger and Barry Windham walk through the door. And the first thing I noticed was they both had to duck when they came through the door. Oh, well, that's a big guy. As they got closer to me, I'm standing on about the 3rd bleacher high in the high school gymnasium, and they both walked past me, and they were at least 4 times wider than I was, and they were still taller than I was. Those guys were huge. And I knew in that moment that if I'd ever had designs on being a professional wrestler, they were over right then. Those guys they're just big. So I can imagine in some way seeing Goliath in that valley, and he's making that challenge. And I'll have to tell you, deep down inside, I think I would have been one of those guys saying, not me. There is no way I'm going down there and facing that guy. And I think most of us probably would fit in that category. Because again, the externals, they impress us. The externals, they make us think. The externals, they make us regard people in a way maybe they don't even deserve, but we still form an opinion. And so imagine how frightening it would have been to match up or to look at a giant that size protected by the amount of armor that he had on and the shield that was being carried beside him, and the odds were stacked against anybody from the Israelite army. And I mean anybody. They didn't have anybody that big. They didn't have anybody that powerful. They just didn't have anybody. Now, Goliath also used a very familiar tactic of the day. It's referred to as one-on-one combat, and a lot of people would do it. He stood and he shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why have you come out to draw up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man for yourselves, and let him come down to me. If he is able to fight with me and kill me, then we will be your servants. But if I prevail against him and kill him, then you shall be our servants and serve us." The whole idea was to preserve your army, to preserve your men, instead of having this full-scale battle where you're going to lose perhaps hundreds of men in a very short time. Well, this army will pick their champion, and this army will pick their champion, and they'll just go at it toe-to-toe, one-on-one, and whoever wins, well, the other team gets the spoils. And so if the other team's champion, he wins, well then you're going to go serve them, and vice versa. And that's what Goliath is proposing. That's what he's suggesting to the Israelites. You just send your champion out here and we'll fight, and when the fight is over, then we will know who is going to serve the other. Whoever won, his army won. Whoever lost, his army lost. And that's the way that it was going to be. Now, Goliath didn't issue this challenge just once. Goliath issued this challenge for 40 days. Every morning he got up, put on his armor, told his poor shield bearer, grab the shield, we're going out again. And he goes out in the valley and he issues this challenge. Every evening he put on his armor, got his shield bearer. They go out in the valley, and he issues the challenge. Every morning, every evening, for 40 days, he issued the challenge. Now, one of the things we might take from that is that the giants you face in your life, maybe it's worry, maybe it's a disease you're dealing with, maybe it's some difficulty at home, but whatever you may be facing in your life, they don't give up, do they? They don't just come around once. If they came around once and we kind of smack them and they go away, they're not particularly giants that we worry about. They're not something that we're going to concern ourselves about. But that's not the way they work, is it? They linger, they hang around. They want to get under your skin. They want to bother you every way that they possibly can. And so as we look at the threats of Goliath and we look at the challenge of Goliath, we learn something about our own fears and our own worries. They don't just come around once, but they're going to plague us. They're going to stay with us. They're going to try to intimidate us. They're going to try to pressure us. They're going to try to worry us. And that's why they're giants. That's why they're so impressive. That's why they seem so unbeatable so often in our lives. And so that leads us from the enemy to think about the encounter. Because Meanwhile, while Goliath's going out in the valley every day and he's issuing this challenge twice a day, about 15 miles away on a hillside, there's a little shepherd boy taking care of his father's sheep. And, he doesn't really have a care in the world outside of protecting the sheep. And as he would say later, obviously there were lions and bears that he had to worry about, but he could take care of those as well. But he's out there taking care of his father's sheep. He didn't know anything about what was going on there in the valley of Elah and what was going on with Goliath. And so he's going about his everyday life. Now, you say, why was he there and not with the army? Well, he was too young to fight. He wasn't old enough yet. His 3 older brothers were, and they were there. But David wasn't old enough, and so he was back with his father, taking care of things at home while his brothers were away to fight the battle against the Philistines. As a matter of fact, at that point, it's fair to reason that David probably had never even heard of Gath. Maybe he had, but he didn't know anything about this guy named Goliath, this giant of a man who was issuing challenges to the people of God. All he did know was that he had 3 older brothers that had gone off to war. 3 older brothers who had followed King Saul into this battle against the Philistines. 3 older brothers that even if David wasn't particularly worried about them, his father was. Jesse was concerned. And he wondered, what's going on with my 3 older sons? What's going on with my boys? And so being concerned about them, Jesse wanted to check in on them. He wanted to send David to take them some provisions and to see what was going on. And so in chapter 17 and verse 17 we read that Jesse said to David his son, "Take for your brothers an ephah of this parched grain and these 10 loaves and carry them quickly to the camp of to your brothers. Also take these 10 cheeses to the commander of their 1,000. See if your brothers are well. Bring some token from them." And I think that's the key line. He sent grain, he sent cheese, he did all of that, but that was a ruse. He just wanted an opportunity to find out, how are my boys? You bring me some word about my boys. See if they're well. And you bring a token back. In other words, you bring proof of life. You show me something that says they are alive and they are well. That's what Jesse wanted. And so when David goes to meet up with the camp of the Israelites on that day, that's exactly what he was there doing. He didn't go there to fight. He didn't go there to challenge a giant. He went there at the behest of his father just to check on his brothers, just to see how they were doing, to make sure they were alive, to make sure they were well. He goes there completely unintentional toward what would ultimately happen on that particular day. Now, later, we find, think about this. Picture the moment, if you will. David gets to the camp and he meets up with his brothers and he's checking on them. He's asking them questions. He's trying to get the information that his father wants. And all of a sudden, as they're sitting there, maybe in their tent, maybe outside their tent, maybe they're looking over the valley, but all of a sudden they hear this loud cry from the valley, and it's that giant again. He's out there again, and he's issuing a challenge again. And he's defying the armies of God. He's defying the Israelites and defying God himself. And David is probably almost shocked by it. And he begins to look around. He's trying to figure out who's doing this, where is it coming from, and what are you guys... Because the text tells us in verse 14 that when all the men of Israel saw the man, they fled from him and they hid. David's standing out here having been talking to his brothers, and they're having a nice conversation. This giant comes out, he begins to shout, and all of a sudden everybody disappears. And David's thinking in his mind, what in the world is going on? Why in the world would this happen with the people of God, with the warriors, the soldiers of God? And again, remember, David had never seen this giant before. He didn't know who he was. He didn't know what he was all about. He had never heard the challenge. He comes into camp on that day. He hears what the giant has to say, and he's standing there alone as everybody else runs for cover. And he just wants to know who is going to take care of this foolish Philistine. Who's going to deal with this? And there's nobody that rises to the answer. He looks across the battlefield. He sees this giant of a guy with all of his armor on, shouting threats and defiance against God and His people. And that made David angry. That made David really angry. And we get to see a little bit into the heart of David. We're told that David was a man after God's own heart. And we see a little bit into the heart of David at this particular point. Yes, he could be a brash young man. He perhaps was impetuous in many ways, and we certainly see that later in his life. But here it's not so much brashness or impetuousness as it is downright indignation. This man, I don't care how big he is, I don't care where he comes from, I don't care what his name is, I don't care who his mom and daddy are. But he dares to defy the God of heaven. He dares to defy the armies of Israel, who are the people of God. And David determines in his mind, he determines in his heart at that moment, nobody, and I mean nobody, talks about my God like that. Have you ever had that feeling? Has that emotion ever come over you? The late Wendell Winkler, who was one of my teachers in college, told a story about his one and only debate back in the 50s in Neosho, Missouri. He debated an infidel, a man who did not believe in the Bible, and I don't think believed in the God of the Bible very much. But they arranged this debate, and it was taking place at the local high school. And he said he had prepared for it for weeks, months, and his father, the late MP Winkler, was going to be his right-hand man. And his father had told him leading up to the debate, now son, you've got to keep your composure. You've got to stay calm. You've got to stay cool. You've got to be nice. You've got to be kind. You've got to do all of these things. He's really pumping him up to stay calm, cool, collected, and kind. Brother Winkler said after that infidel's first speech, where he defamed God in every way you could possibly imagine, he started to rise to go to the microphone for his first speech of the debate, and he said he felt a hand on his arm pulling him back down into the chair, and it was his father. And he said all he heard from that point was his father say, "Skin him, son." Calm, cool, and collected went out the window. You ever been there? Somebody saying things about God, somebody saying things about the church, somebody saying things about the Bible. You know they're not true. You know that they need to hear the truth. Do we get welled up inside like David did? Angry like David did? Indignant like David did? Nobody talks about God like that. And so then again, the question rushes into his mind. So why is everybody running? And I'll admit, I have to ask that question sometimes too. We turn on the television and we hear people saying all sorts of things that are impeaching of God, that are disgraceful about God, that are impugning God. And you have to wonder, why are people running? Why don't God's people stand up and face that? Why don't God's people do something about that? Why am I not doing something about it? Why am I not angry? David hears the giant. He hears the challenge. And he wants to know who is going to face him. Who is going to teach this man a lesson? Well, it's at this point in the story that we learn David faced more barriers than just a giant. That giant wasn't the only problem at that particular point. Because then we learn David had to face his brothers. Look in verse 28 And now Eliab, his eldest brother, heard when he spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David. He wasn't angry at the giant, he was angry at David. Sometimes we get angry at the wrong people. But his anger was kindled against David, and he said, "Why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, for you have come down to see the battle." Again, time out just for a minute. Let's back up. You know Eliab. You know who Eliab is. Eliab was that strapping young man, walked into Jesse's house, and Samuel said, "That's the king." God said, "No, he's not." Eliab's the one that saw Samuel go to each of his other brothers. None of them were the king either. Until that ruddy-haired little shepherd boy came walking in the door. And all of a sudden, Samuel found a king. Eliab was there when Samuel poured that horn of oil over David's head to anoint him to be the next king of Israel, whenever that might be, whenever it was going to take place. But he was anointed to be the next king. And Eliab apparently assumed the worst of his brother. Berkeley, in his translation of this passage, says that Eliab asked, "Why have you really come?" In other words, he suspected his motives were not pure. Why have you really come here? Are you just trying to make a name for yourself? Are you just trying to stir up trouble? Are you just trying to embarrass the rest of us? Why did you really come? And so he had a bothered brother that he had to deal with. On top of that, he had a coward king. I mean, Saul was there. The king was there. Anybody remember the description of Saul that we have when he was first coronated, brought before the people? Anybody remember how they described Saul? 1 Samuel chapter 9 and verse 2 and talks about Saul. There was not a man among the people of Israel more handsome than he was. And notice that last line. From his shoulders upward he was taller than any of the people. Now, I don't know how tall Saul was. He apparently wasn't as tall as Goliath, but he was certainly taller than anybody else. If this giant was going to come into the valley and challenge the people, the perfect one to have gone down in the valley and faced the giant for the people would have been this king that was hiding in his tent and afraid to go out. When the leaders of God's people will not do what's right, they can't really hope for God's people to do what's right. When the leaders of God's people will run from the challenges that the world puts against us, we can't really expect God's people to stand up against those challenges very well. God expects His leaders to stand up. He expects His leaders to fight. He expects His leaders to do something. Saul wasn't that guy. And Saul wasn't going to do anything about this giant. He was not going to fight. And he basically admits that. Now, as you know, the text goes on to tell us about the encounter between David and Saul. And as Drew read for us earlier, David comes in, Saul looks at him and said, "What are you going to do? You're just a kid. You're but a youth. You can't go out and fight this giant." But David describes to Saul how in the past God had proved Himself faithful when he was faced with a challenge of a lion and a bear, and he was delivered from both of them. And he said, "I will deliver, and God will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." If I'm not going to worry about a lion, and I'm not going to worry about a bear, I'm certainly not going to worry about this Philistine, because I know the power of my God. So often, when we're facing our giants, when we're facing our troubles, we forget what we ought to remember, and we remember what we ought to forget. You see, we see the challenges instead of the possibilities. We see the failures that we've had in the past instead of the victories that God has helped us to gain. We remember our defeats instead of our victories, and most of us can recite our failures one right after the other. Our victories, well, we have to think about them a little bit more. But if we think about what God has accomplished in us in the past, it will help us to do much more for God in the future. If we will trust that God was able to do this then, God is able to do it now and into the future. But I'm going to have to learn to trust God. And so there's that whole scene of Saul trying to fit David with his armor. People want to know, is there humor in the Bible? I think this is one of those spots where we find humor in the Bible. Saul, by his description, he had to be at least like a 52 long, and David couldn't have been more than a 32 short. And so you're putting this great big piece of armor on this little boy, and it's not going to fit, and there's no way he's going to be able to move or maneuver or do anything. And David just says, look, I remember fighting that bear, and I remember fighting that lion, and I remember what I used then. I'll just use the same thing now. And so in his simple dress, his simple weaponage, he goes out to fight this giant. He goes out to do battle. Verse 40 tells us that he took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook, put them in his shepherd's pouch, and his sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now, I'm not going to do to you what I had a preacher do to me years ago. I went to hear a preacher that I knew and that I admired and I loved, and he preached that night on David and Goliath. And he told us at the very beginning of the sermon, he said, I'm going to tell you at the end of this sermon why he chose 5 stones when he only needed 1. And he preached a great sermon. It was a magnificent sermon. But I'm going to admit to you, he lied to me because he never told me why there's 5 instead of just 1. He probably didn't intend to. He may have just forgotten. But I never did learn at least his reason or his thoughts behind why there are 5. But he chose 5 stones. He put them in his sack, and he went out to face this giant. And the beautiful thing about this story is it tells us something about the way that God operates. He magnifies His name when we are at our weakest. We don't have to be the most eloquent. We don't have to be the strongest. We don't have to be the most handsome. We don't have to be the most of anything. Because when we are weak, God is going to magnify His strength. And He honors our faith and our trust in Him when we are willing to give it all to Him. Now, these stones were there for a reason. God put them there. I believe that. God put them there. And they were there because He knew that David was going to need to use these stones. And these stones were powerful enough to do what needed to be done on that day. I wonder sometimes, 1 Peter 2 and verse 5 describes the church as living stones. If God can do that with 1 stone out of the middle of a brook, I wonder what He can do with a house full of living stones. What things we can conquer, what things we can overcome. And so we need to trust God more. And that's the encounter. Last thing I want to leave you with, and I know that bell just rang, so I've got to draw this to a close. But I want to think about the example that we're given. I want to draw 4 lessons, if you will, from this particular story that I think will help us. God doesn't want us to waste victories. They're there for a reason, and there's a lesson to learn. And there's a lesson to learn from this particular victory as well. One of the things I think we learn from this victory is facing giants is an intimidating experience. The people of Israel were intimidated. Saul was intimidated. I don't know that David was not intimidated to some degree, although the text never tells us that he ever shuddered, he ever worried, he ever drew back. He was ready because he trusted God. And he knew in his heart, my God is greater. A second lesson we learn from this is that doing battle is often a lonely experience. You're going to face things in your life nobody can really help you with. The preacher may try, and as much as he might try, he may not be able to. The elders may try, and as much as they try, they may not be able to. The counselor may try, and as much as they try, they may not be able to. There are some things in every one of our lives we have to face alone. But with God, we're not alone. And we're never alone. Paul said in 2 Timothy chapter 4 that at my first defense no man stood with me, but God. God was with me. And other people may try to minimize what you're going through. But let me tell you something. Your Goliath is your Goliath. Your Goliath may not be mine, but it is yours. And you need to have the faith and the trust in God and the courage to face that Goliath and to conquer that Goliath by trusting in God. Third lesson I want to give to you is trusting God is a stabilizing experience. I tried to shoot slings when I was a kid, and I'll admit to you it didn't go very well. Those stones didn't go where I wanted them to go. And I don't know if you've ever tried it or not, but there's a skill to that. David obviously was very skilled, and he had developed that over time. But I have to admit, I don't know how one stone from one sling goes into the forehead of a man 9 feet 9 inches tall, and all of a sudden it's over. I don't know how that works. Except that because he trusted God, his aim was true, he didn't miss his mark, and it turned out just the way God intended for it to turn out. But he had to trust, and he had to put his faith in God. And then one final lesson, and that is winning victories is a memorable experience. This story is told over and over again for a reason. This story is remembered the way that it is remembered for a reason. We need to know about these victories. We need to share with others our victories. We need to tell people what our God can and will do. And so I don't know what giant you may be facing tonight. I don't know what difficulty may be ahead of you. It could be a job, it could be your mate, it could be your school, it could be a person, it could be a lawsuit, it could be unemployment, it could be some disaster. I don't know. But I know we all deal with them. We all deal with them in one way or another. But God wants you to know right now, all I ask of you is 5 smooth stones in a sling of faith, and I'll take care of the rest. Trust me. And you can trust God. The battle belongs to the Lord. If you're here tonight and you need to respond, if you need to put your faith in Jesus and make a commitment to Him by submitting to baptism through your faith and your repentance and your confession, I want to encourage you to do that. If you're here tonight and you've already been baptized, but your faith isn't as strong as it needs to be, you've got giants in your life that are overcoming you, you need to come back to God. You need to put your full faith and trust in Him. You need to confess that to Him. Ask your brethren for help, for prayers, for strength. If you need to do that tonight, won't you come while together we stand and sing?